The day she finally smiled at my bakery, she was standing beside a hospital bed, holding a paper bag with my name written across it in trembling handwriting. I had spent 3 years believing she hated me, never realizing that every morning she walked through my door carrying a grief so heavy she could barely breathe. And when she looked at me that day and whispered, "You already know my order," I understood that the woman I thought was avoiding me had actually been trusting me with the one small piece of her life she could no longer explain. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. My name is Everett Hale, and for most of my adult life, I believed people came into a bakery because they wanted something sweet. I was wrong. Sometimes they came because they needed somewhere warm to stand for 5 minutes. Sometimes they came because the smell of cinnamon reminded them of a mother they had lost. Sometimes they came because they had nowhere else to go. I learned that after opening Hale and Honey on a quiet corner of Maple Street, a narrow little bakery with green awnings, scratched wooden tables, and windows that fogged whenever I pulled a fresh tray of bread from the oven. My wife, Lillian, had helped me build it from almost nothing. She had painted the walls herself, chosen the mismatched chairs, and written our first menu in careful black letters. She used to say that a bakery should smell like forgiveness because everybody deserved a place where yesterday could be left outside. Then Lillian died, and the bakery became the only place where I could still hear her. 3 years after her funeral, I had learned how to smile at customers without feeling like I was betraying my grief. I knew who wanted extra cream in their coffee, who bought sourdough every Tuesday, who secretly slipped pastries to their grandchildren, and who came in pretending they had forgotten their wallet because they were embarrassed to admit they were short on money. But there was one customer I never understood. Her name, I eventually learned, was Mara Ellison. She began coming into the bakery every weekday morning at exactly 8:10. She was always alone, always dressed simply, usually in a navy cardigan or gray coat, and she carried a canvas tote against her side as if she were protecting something fragile inside it. She never smiled. Not once. At first, I thought she disliked me. Whenever I greeted her, she would lower her eyes. If I tried making conversation, she would nod politely and stare at the pastry case. She never sat down. She never lingered. She would pay, take her bag, and leave within 2 minutes. After a few weeks, I stopped trying. I simply prepared her order before she reached the counter: 1 cinnamon roll, warmed but not iced, and a small black coffee with exactly 2 sugars. She would look at the bag, then at me, and sometimes something flickered across her face, something almost like gratitude, but it disappeared so quickly I wondered if I had imagined it. One morning, I finally asked, "How did you find us?" She froze. It was the first time I had ever seen her look frightened. For several seconds, she stared at me as though I had asked a question I wasn't supposed to know the answer to. Then she quietly said, "Someone told me about this place." Before I could ask who, she picked up her bag and walked out. I watched her through the front window as she crossed the street and disappeared around the corner. There was something about the way she hurried away that bothered me. It wasn't the walk of someone who disliked me. It was the walk of someone afraid of being recognized. Days turned into weeks. Then months. The routine never changed. At 8:10, Mara appeared. At 8:11, her cinnamon roll went into the warming oven. At 8:12, her coffee was ready. And at 8:13, she was gone. She never smiled, but she never missed a morning either. Then, one Tuesday, she didn't come. I noticed immediately. At 8:20, I caught myself looking through the window. At 8:30, I checked the sidewalk again. By noon, I felt foolish for worrying about a woman I barely knew. But the next morning she wasn't there either. Or the next. After a week, I found myself staring at the cinnamon rolls sitting untouched behind the glass, wondering why one missing customer could make the bakery feel so strangely empty. 10 days later, a young man entered carrying a folded piece of paper. He looked exhausted, perhaps 25, with dark hair, red-rimmed eyes, and the posture of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. He walked to the counter and asked whether I was Everett Hale. When I said yes, he placed the paper in front of me. It was Mara's handwriting. My hands became cold as I unfolded it. It contained only one sentence: "Please don't let him take the box." I looked up, confused, and the young man whispered, "My name is Jonah. I'm Mara's son." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I remembered the canvas tote she always carried. I remembered the way she looked frightened when I asked who had told her about the bakery. And suddenly the 3 years of silence felt less like coincidence and more like pieces of a puzzle I had never known I was solving. Jonah told me his mother was in the hospital. She had collapsed at work and doctors had discovered a serious heart condition she had been ignoring for months. But that wasn't why he had come to me. He had found a box in her apartment after the ambulance took her away. Inside were dozens of receipts from my bakery, carefully folded and dated. 3 years' worth. Then he showed me something else. A photograph. I knew the woman in the picture instantly. Lillian. My wife stood outside the bakery on opening day, laughing with flour on her cheek. Beside her was a younger Mara, smiling broadly with one arm around Lillian's shoulders. My chest tightened. How did my wife know your mother? Jonah swallowed hard. They were best friends. The room seemed to tilt beneath me. Lillian had never mentioned Mara. Not once. Jonah told me that before Hale and Honey existed, Lillian and Mara had worked together at a community center. They had become close after Mara's husband died unexpectedly, leaving her alone to raise Jonah. When Lillian and I started planning the bakery, Mara had helped with the paperwork, the furniture, even the first batches of test recipes. Then, 3 months before the bakery opened, Mara and Lillian had a terrible argument. What about? I asked. Jonah hesitated. Then he said, "My father." I stared at him. Jonah explained that his father, Daniel, had died in a construction accident. At least, that was what everyone believed. But Mara had always suspected the company had covered up safety violations, and Lillian had helped her gather documents proving it. The evidence was supposed to go to an attorney. But before that happened, the company owner threatened Mara and Jonah. Mara became terrified. Lillian promised she would help. And then, 3 days later, Lillian was killed in the car accident that took her life. I had spent years believing Lillian's death was a tragic accident caused by a wet road and a careless driver. Jonah's voice broke when he told me there had been another car involved. A company vehicle. The police had never connected it to the case because the driver had fled. I couldn't breathe. All those years of grief suddenly had a question inside them. Had Lillian's death really been an accident? Jonah reached into his backpack and pulled out an old metal key. My mother says the truth is in the bakery. I stared at the key. What box? He looked toward the kitchen. The box she told you not to let him take. Before I could ask who him was, the bakery door opened. A tall man in an expensive gray suit stepped inside. Jonah went completely still. I recognized him immediately. Graham Voss. The owner of the construction company responsible for the project where Daniel Ellison had died. He smiled as though we were old friends. "I believe," he said calmly, "you have something that belongs to me." My instincts told me to say nothing. I stepped between him and Jonah. Graham's smile vanished. "Mr. Hale, your wife had a habit of getting involved in matters that didn't concern her. I'd hate for you to make the same mistake." For the first time since Lillian died, I felt something stronger than grief. Anger. I told him to leave. He did, but not before looking directly at Jonah and saying, "Your mother should have learned years ago that some things are better forgotten." When the door closed behind him, Jonah whispered, "That's him." We locked the bakery door and searched every inch of the building. The key didn't fit the cash register, the office cabinet, or the old storage room. Finally, I noticed something beneath the wooden floor behind the flower shelves. One board was slightly raised. My hands shook as I lifted it. Beneath the floor was a small metal box. Inside were documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to me. I recognized Lillian's handwriting immediately. My knees nearly gave out. The letter began with an apology. Lillian wrote that she had hidden the truth because she was afraid that if I knew what was happening, I would try to protect her and put myself in danger. She said Mara had asked her to keep the evidence safe until she could find someone trustworthy enough to take it to an attorney. Then came the sentence that broke something inside me. "If anything happens to me, Everett, please don't hate Mara." She begged me to walk away. I didn't listen. I read the letter twice. Then 3 times. At the bottom, Lillian had written, "She thinks she caused what happened to me. Please help her understand that she didn't." Suddenly I remembered every morning Mara had stood at my counter without smiling. Every time she lowered her eyes. Every time she took that cinnamon roll and left without saying much. She hadn't been avoiding me. She had been punishing herself. I found Mara's hospital room that afternoon. She looked smaller than I remembered, lying beneath a white blanket with an oxygen tube beneath her nose. When she saw me, her eyes filled immediately. "I didn't want you to know," she whispered. I sat beside her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she told me everything. The morning of Lillian's accident, Mara had called her and begged her not to meet the attorney. She was terrified. She told Lillian to destroy the evidence and walk away. Lillian refused. They argued. Mara believed that argument had sent Lillian onto the road at the wrong time. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt. She had started coming to my bakery because it was the last place where Lillian had left something of herself. She ordered the cinnamon roll because it had been Lillian's favorite. The 2 sugars in her coffee were because Lillian had once joked that Mara made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I looked at her trembling hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because every time I looked at you, I saw the man who lost everything because of my fear." I reached across the bed and held her hand. "You didn't take my wife from me." Her eyes filled with tears. "Then why did you never smile?" She gave a broken little laugh through her tears. "Because I didn't think I deserved to." That sentence stayed with me. We turned the evidence over to the authorities and an attorney. Months of investigation followed. The documents proved the construction company had concealed safety violations, and the driver connected to Lillian's accident was eventually identified. Graham Voss was arrested for obstruction and related crimes connected to the cover-up. The truth didn't bring Lillian back. Nothing could. But it finally allowed the people she had left behind to stop blaming themselves. Mara recovered slowly. Her heart condition required treatment, but she began taking care of herself in a way she hadn't done for years. Jonah visited her every day. And every Saturday morning, he brought her to my bakery. The first time she returned, I had already prepared her order. 1 cinnamon roll, warmed but not iced. 1 small black coffee. 2 sugars. She stood at the counter and stared at them. Then something extraordinary happened. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't the kind people make for photographs. It was small, fragile, and uncertain, but it was real. "You already know my order," she said. I smiled back. "I've known it for 3 years." She looked toward the empty chair by the window. That was Lillian's favorite seat. "I know." She sat down. And for the first time, she stayed. Months later, we placed a small framed photograph of Lillian beside that table. Beneath it, we wrote the words she had once said while painting our bakery walls, Everyone deserves a place where yesterday can be left outside. Mara began helping me at the bakery twice a week. Jonah started learning how to bake. Some mornings, we burned the first batch of muffins and laughed about it. Other mornings, customers came in carrying problems we couldn't solve, and we simply gave them something warm to eat and a place to sit. One afternoon, nearly a year after Mara first walked through my door, I found her standing behind the counter, tying an apron around her waist. She looked at the framed photograph of Lillian and quietly said, "I spent 3 years thinking grief meant keeping myself miserable because I missed someone. I waited." She smiled. "Now I think maybe grief means learning how to love someone even after they're gone." I looked around the bakery. Sunlight poured through the front windows, touching the wooden tables and turning the flour in the air into tiny golden sparks. For the first time since Lillian died, the bakery didn't feel like a place where I was preserving the past. It felt like a place where we were allowed to build something new. Speech balloon special request: before the story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in this situation? If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful and inspiring stories. Your support encourages us to keep creating stories that touch hearts around the world. Years later, I still remember the first morning Mara smiled. I used to think that smile belonged to me, to the bakery, or perhaps to some secret finally uncovered. But I eventually understood that it belonged entirely to her. She had earned it. She had walked through guilt, grief, fear, and regret and discovered that forgiveness wasn't about pretending the past never happened. It was about refusing to let the past decide what happened next. Sometimes the people who seem cold are simply carrying pain they don't know how to put down. Sometimes a familiar order is more than food and coffee, it is a quiet promise that someone remembers you. And sometimes the greatest second chance in life begins with something as simple as opening a door, remembering a person's order, and giving them one more reason to smile.